Whether it's the sprawling lore of Warhammer 40k or our own isolated fanfics that we've written ourselves, fiction is often a great driving force behind the paint schemes that we apply to our miniatures. And this can come from a broad range of places. For example, in the Horus Heresy fiction, I remember reading about a chapter of word bearers who still wear grey battle plate, and that was my inspiration for my word bearer's Dark Apostle. You might remember recently that there was a Marvel comic for Marneus Calgar, and I took at least colour inspiration from that for my Marneus Calgar. It's not necessarily painted comic book style, but I was definitely looking at the palette that they used for those comic books. But every now and again we definitely like to make our own fiction for our armies, our Necromunda gangs, our Stargrave crews for example. Spoiler alert, that's foreshadowing. And when we do this, we normally take the approach of deciding a colour scheme first and then building the fiction for that particular unit, army, crew, etc. What happens if you go about it the other way round? My Stargrave crew is led by the brutal Queen Bun. She's a biomorphic mutant who has to constantly eat in order to stop her body from burning up because of her mutations. Her right-hand woman is a cyborg called Chiffona, and when I wrote the fiction for Chiffona, I introduced her just with a couple of lines of text. By the time Chiffona arrived, gliding silently and lazily on her wingpack's repulsor blade, Queen Bun had finished her stand of pastries and was gripping a serf by the scruff and demanding that they replenish the treat. Chiffona, first confectioner to Queen Bun, shed little in her presentation to her liege. She was an athletically built woman in a form-fitting suit of scarlet and gold armour. Her long purple bob of hair was shiny and full of vitality, and her pale blue skin sparkled with a pearlescent glow, even in the dimness of the Queen's chamber. Now you can probably tell from some of the specifics in that description that I already had an idea in mind for the miniature I wanted to use for Chiffona, and that was Reaper's amazing jetpack Sophie. The moment I saw this miniature I knew that it was going into a Stargrave crew. It's just beautiful and I love it. But honestly, up until the very moment I finished writing those lines of text, I had no plan in mind for how I was going to paint her. Now the basis of my inspiration, and again you might have already picked up on this from the text, was Iron Man of all things, specifically the sort of later MCU iterations from Infinity War and Endgame. And as will be revealed by the end of this video, it's not really a surprise that I chose that, but you will see why later. So I had a basic visual inspiration in mind which had led me to a more unpacked, more fleshed out, descriptive inspiration, and that had helped me choose a model, and I really needed to kind of think about a colour scheme now. So how do we translate that through into painting a miniature? Well, that's the fun part. To kick things off, we need to talk Scarlet. And immediately we hit our first point of confusion. Now in my head, Scarlet is a very deep, bold and saturated red, and according to a Google search, Google seems to basically agree with me, although it never really actually gave a good answer. But then I switched over to Google image search and it's immediately just a cluster bang of conflicting, confusing images that make no cohesive sense. But in the end, after a bit of umming and ahhing, I decided to just kind of go with my gut on this one. I took a really deep red and I started looking through my reds and found sort of all of my brightest reds to work up over the top of that. And in my head I was thinking here, I want to go kind of as bright in the realm of reds as I can without encroaching into any kind of yellows, because I don't want it to conflict with the gold. And speaking of the gold, it really doesn't get any easier when we start choosing golds either. Like, do I go for metallic golds? That's an option, I've got lots of those. Or do I go for that more sort of traditional heraldic meaning of like a warm shaded yellow? Iron Man in the movies has that kind of metallic yellow. Is that an option? Do we do an NMM? There's so many things to think of. And in the end, I sort of found myself just feeling like, what even is gold? But if you're anything like me, you probably find this process of figuring stuff out and being forced to make tough decisions is entirely its own fun and reward. So it's worth it. So once these two main colours were decided, then things did start to get a little bit easier, because the rest of the colours kind of fell into things that recipes that I already have locked into my head, things that I already have in my brain. We call this our repertoire. And so it wasn't actually too long after that I ended up with a finished miniature that I was pretty happy with. And so I suppose if you've watched this far into what is essentially a pretty self-indulgent video about part of my creative process, you're probably going to want to at least know what Chiffona came out looking like. Go on then, you've twisted my arm. However, underneath all my self-aggrandizing about how clever I am, there is actually a lesson to be learned here. There are some takeaways. You can see here that I've drawn my inspiration from Marvel a couple of times already with my Stargrave crew, with a couple of other miniatures here that are based on Rogue and Wolverine. I mean, even my current work in progress, Queen Bun herself, which I am in the middle of painting as I'm recording this video, you can probably tell which X-Men character she's inspired by. So if there are some takeaways and some lessons when it comes to pulling fiction together into inspiration and turning it into paint schemes, maybe we should talk for a second about what those things are. Well, first of all, once you've written fiction and been inspired by it, make sure that you still go looking for visual references. After all, you are working in the visual space. It's good to still have an idea of how you want something to look before you start committing paint to miniature. Premeditate your colour workups, go over your collection of paints, get some ideas based on paints that you actually own. You don't want to have to go shopping before you can even start a piece. If you're currently feeling really high with inspiration, that's just going to make a barrier. Be consistent. My Marvel Stargrave crew shares Marvel as a theme. Pick one for your project and stick to it. Remember your repertoire. This one is so important. Don't overlook stuff that you already know. Don't assume that you need to reinvent the wheel every time you start a new project. If you have a workup for black that you really like, that you think looks good, run with it, use it. Paint things in the order that you feel inspired. And yeah, as a caveat, this is not the best way to paint armies. But for smaller projects like this that are made up of individual models, that you're kind of going to paint every model in the project to the same sort of standard, it's, usually a fairly small number. Don't worry about what order you paint them in. Don't strain for inspiration on a miniature where you don't have the inspiration yet. Paint the ones that you know what you want to do with, and while you're working on that and enjoying it and getting hype from it, the inspiration will start to come anyway. And with those tools in the bag, I think it can be really fun, really exciting, and actually super educational, taking a bit of a break away from painting, stock schemes, and using your favourite fiction or some fiction that you've created as inspiration for your painting. Just sourcing from somewhere different for a change. And so that's all from me this week, folks. As always, I'd like to invite you to like, share and subscribe, and please do make sure to check out the links in the description if you wish to support the channel, because those are all the best ways of doing so. So thank you so much for watching, everybody, and until next time, I will see you in the next one. I want to wish you happy hobbying, and bye bye for now.